Welcome, everybody. Well, that was a good 2 days, wasn't it? I went to some talks, absolutely inspirational, informative. I learned some things. I love Joe's talk about accessibility. We've got to keep focusing on that. Super, super important. It's a shame everything's got to come to an end, but we are coming to the back end of SDC 23. However, got a great way to finish. We're going to close out the event with our final keynote, which is titled Breaking Boundaries in Narrative. It's a conversation with Rhianna Pratchett, a remarkable and well-known writer and narrative designer. Hosted by our very own Zoe Curnoe, the Timbre Games studio director. Welcome, Rhianna and Zoe, and over to you.
Thank you, Gary. I've been very excited about this conversation for a long time, so I think you're going to enjoy it. Well, I was thinking about what I wanted to talk to you about. And because this is about breaking barriers in games and doing what you've done and the history of your career, when you started out, there weren't really narrative designers or writers in games. And it was kind of, I think when we were talking about it earlier, saying, yeah, it was like just that guy over there is a pretty good writer. Maybe he can write some dialogue for us.
Yeah, I mean, there were a few narrative designers around. Yeah. I think the first person that I know of to use the title narrative designer was Mary DeMol when she worked on the Myst games. And Ubisoft really did kind of champion the role of narrative designer. But as far as writers go, I started off as a journalist. I worked for the late great PC Zone magazine, and I went all around the world for a couple of years, like meeting developers and seeing how games are made and, doing lots of interviews and previews and things like that. And I never met a me. No one said, this is our writer. No one really even talked about the writing. Yeah. Like, it was just something that was done by whoever had the time and inclination to do it. Right. Like, it was the one area of game development that wasn't really done by a professional in that field, which seems extremely odd now. Yeah. But yeah, it just used to run like that, and it wasn't. It was considered kind of unimportant for the majority of games, really.
And what was it like when you had that first role? And you had to be like, I'm here, I can write this game for you. What kind of things did you have to convince that team of or push through to?
I sort of got in it sort of accidentally, or at least the career came, my career has really been a series of wandering in and out of accidents. And so it was Beyond Divinity, and I was a big fan of the first game, which is called Divine Divinity, which is a terrible name, and even developers, which are Larian Studios, who are still going strong, admitted. And I was like one of the few journalists in the UK that really liked it. And I had a reputation on Zone that if I really liked something, I was like super passionate and just wanted to give it all the awards and things. And they'd kind of remembered me, and they knew I'd gone freelance from Zone, and they were working on a standalone game called Beyond Divinity. And they were just looking for someone who could polish up the script. And I ended up doing a bit of original content. I wrote a little novella that was shipped, like with the game in certain stores and things like that, and I remember nothing about it. I don't remember the plot at all. I'm really sorry. It was probably quite bad, and I think the Larian team are like, the writers are like made to read it as part of like because it came kind of Divinity canon, and obviously the Divinity world is still going strong. They're made to read it, I think, and I feel very bad about that. But yeah, it put me off working on role-playing games for a long time, because they're so large and unwieldy, and keeping track of all the kind of narrative arcs and plot points was very difficult. So I sort of came out of it thinking, right, I don't want to do that again, but I kind of like the shape of it, and I appear to have found something here that is more interesting than like continually pitching to editors, and so I just kind of went to people whose games I liked. It was all very kind of low-key and casual. Yeah. And it's like, hey, I'm doing this now. Do you have any work? And it sort of kind of
seems like evolved. It worked out.
Yeah, it evolved out of that. So I I worked on a SpongeBob game, and I got to watch a lot of SpongeBob, which was the best thing
Good
about
research.
that. And yeah, I think I worked for a company called International Hobo, who had worked on another game that I was very excited about at Zone, which was called Ghostmaster. And I think I joined there like the Ghostmaster forum, and it turned out that some of the designers at International Hobo had worked on Discord Noir, so they saw my name come up and they got in contact. I ended up working with International Hobo doing like bits and pieces of script stuff. So a SpongeBob game, a Pac-Man game, and then I started doing mission design for Stronghold Legends because I'm a big fan of the Stronghold games. And it's sort of funny how things work out, because I remember when I was at Zone, I went to possibly my weirdest set press trip, which was in the deep end of a disused swimming pool in Munich, and they just set up like the deep end, three like stations for the developers to show their games, and there was
swimming pool.
In a swimming pool, yeah, and it was so cold. I remember that, but I also remember that there was a sort of driving shooting game. I was like, whatever, but there was like a castle game. We'd like to, you could see the microcosm of the castle. You could see the corn being grown and then harvested and then turned into corn and then to bread. And I thought that was wonderful. And like I ignore the other game, which was actually GTA 3, I think. But to be fair, the houses never get me any work, and Stronghold have. So I was friendly with the developers there and ended up working on one of their games. And then it was sort of Heavenly Sword, which is really sort of what kick-started my career. And again, that was one where I'd just been hanging around the industry a lot, and I'd gone to a couple of talks that I think I met Tamim, who's the creative director, at a screenwriting workshop where the guy running it really wanted to get into games, and he sort of gathered up all the people in the games industry, or that come from the games industry, and I was kind of hoping to get sort of work off them. But because both myself and Tamim were kind of writers, he wasn't interested in kind of us, and we were sat next to each other, and we bonded over mutual hatred of the guy running the workshop. And then I went to a talk that Tamim was doing, talking about how hard it was to get Heavenly Sword into production, and I would just. I was saying, where are you with writers and stuff? And he said, we've done one round, but we haven't really found anyone. We're going to do a second round soon. And I was just like, I'd had a couple of JDs and Diet Cokes, so I was feeling a bit bullshy. So I was like, you consider me? And he was like, oh, yeah, sure, we can give you a test. And I thought, I'm never going to hear from him again. And then, 3 months later, someone from Sony got in touch, and I sort of spent my Christmas holidays writing a test for them. And then I got into... I got given an interview, and it was like a 4-hour interview, and they were just, which is not the longest interview I've had, but it was certainly a lot. And when I spent a long time talking about Aliens and Conan and all the 80s fantasy movies and sci-fi I'd grown up with, and they kept shuffling people in and out of the room during it, and then they actually went out into the corridor, got into a huddle and whispered, and then came back and offered me the job on that.
And then you were the writer for Heavenly Sword.
Yeah, and that certainly kicked things up a lot, because it was...
I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about collaboration. I was curious about what, as that external writer, sometimes coming into that development team, which I'm sure a lot of people have experienced, there can be a little bit of a distance between that external writer. And what is kind of the ideal collaborative setup that you've seen when you are that external writer coming in? And what are some of the things that you've seen that work really well? And maybe what are some of the things that don't work, that maybe people in this room can learn from, of experiences you've had?
Well, actually, one of the most fun and I think most collaborative games that I've worked on was actually the Overlord games, Overlord 1 and 2 with Tramp Studios over in the Netherlands. So not a vast team. I think maybe on the first game it was about 40 people. I would go over to Tramp Studios in the Netherlands, probably about 3 or 4 times during the projects for a week or so, and I got to know every designer. And I think maybe the key is finding out who's got to make your script work, who's got to sweat to put that in the game, and then sort of finding them and working with them. So For Overlord, I would work with every single designer directly. Like it was nice because it was a small team, and you can sort of speak to like the
so you're
level
actually
designers.
with that person who's implementing your dialogue.
Yeah,
in
and
the game.
even though I wasn't on site, we just used file convergence system. We ICQ back in the days of ICQ.
I remember ICQ. We're aging ourselves, but yeah.
I would talk with every designer, and they would talk to me about what was happening in their levels, what were the things they needed narrative support on, like, is there going to be a new monster or a new minion or a new power or something, and I'd talk about what I needed to happen narratively, and we'd talk about where there was space sort of in the environment for that. So we would work on creating something that supported what I needed narratively and what they needed from a level design point of view and a gameplay point of view. And that meant when they got the script, it sort of more or less fitted their level,
right?
Rather than just being given a script that they had no input into. And I think that was the most important thing. And I've never really got that level of collaboration since, because I've usually worked on much bigger teams where there's several layers of people in between you and the person who's got to sweat to get your words into the game. And so that can, that does exacerbate the feeling of being removed.
Yeah, being that separated.
But I think it's allowing writers and narrative designers, particularly if they're off-site, to come in and work with people like level designers and artists and sort of empowering everyone to be involved in story, because everything contributes to story, the art, the music, the level design, the mechanics, and so sort of empowering everyone to understand how their particular discipline folds into storytelling, I think is great, and that's when you get some really wonderful things.
You were mentioning that earlier, that sometimes maybe an art direction can make the wrong choice, or maybe there's some environmental storytelling and it doesn't fit the story, and how it's so important that the writer is aware of those things, because you're creating that whole world, and then one little thing can break that, can't it? Yeah,
I mean, it's kind of what they call ludonarrative dissonance, but it basically means when the story is saying one thing and the gameplay is saying another, and we came across that somewhat with Tomb Raider, and I've often talked about like the first kill in Tomb Raider and how, I'm not particularly blaming anyone, at least not publicly blaming anyone for what happened, but because I understand why each kind of group had the goals that they had, and we kind of made a big deal about Lara reacting in a more human way to things. So when she's got her first human kill, she's very shaken by what she's done, and she kind of retching, and she throws the gun away, and she kind of picks it up again, and she's clearly very distraught over what she'd done. And when I originally wrote that scene, then there was a sort of a little bit of kind of working way through the level before she had a scene where she was reflecting on it with her kind of mentor figure, Roth, and she originally I wrote the scene with her and Roth as a cinematic, and she was sort of, you could tell from her body language how she was feeling about it, and she'd only really heard his voice for the first time and realised he was alive, and she's just, something has broken in her, because it's broken her sense of who she is and what she's capable of, and she's sort of struggling with that, and she says to Ross, Lara says to Ross, that I had to kill someone, Ross, and he was like, that can't have been easy, and she said it's scary how easy it was, and you can see it in the cinematic, you could sort of see her becoming more like fetal position over the radio and things, and it was quite an emotional scene, and then what happened was, in between first kill and reflecting on first kill, it was something like 42 kills were then put into it, because it's like, okay, Lara's got a gun now, we know what happens around the corner, there's things to shoot, and just like, and the playtesters kind of like, okay, gun, we know what happens, and narrative knew we would get just like, but you're taking this character moment and you're just mugging it, and like you go around the corner, it's just like she's another character, and that the kind of emotional scene with Ross, that was changed to she's climbing up a ladder, having this emotional conversation, and yeah, we kind of kicked back against it. I think it got reduced to 16 kills, and she's still having to say to Rob, I had to kill some people, some people, like, and yeah. So that I use that as a good example of okay, this is everyone. Was what they had their own goals, and I'm not saying those goals are wrong, but actually seeing what you're saying about the character, what is that gameplay saying about the character, and is that what you want to be saying? And if you want to be saying something different, maybe look at different styles of gameplay. Like had I like had the hard power, I would have said, okay, she chucks the gun off a cliff. It's going to be frustrating, but you're with the character, you understand why she's done it, and she's going to have to she knows she's capable, and she's living with that. You're letting that moment breathe. You're letting that character live with what they've done a bit. And so that when she has to pick up a gun again, she knows the implications of that. She knows that she's capable of doing it. And, that if I'd had hard power, as a kind of independent contractor, you don't usually, that's probably what I would have done and found some other way of, different kind of gameplay in between that.
I realize that some people in the audience may not know that you were the main writer for the Tomb Raider reboot. If anyone knows, Tomb Raider was a very popular game on the PlayStation 1 back in the day, in the 90s, and it was rebooted in the mid-2000s, and Rhianna was the main writer for that, and Rise of the Tomb Raider after that.
The first two,
two of my favorite games. But that actually brings me to actually a question. Great, you're giving me great segues, thanks. Many of the big AAA games you've worked on, Tomb Raider, Mirror's Edge, and Heavenly Sword, have main characters that are women. And was that intentional, or is that something you were drawn to? And is that something that, creating those more diverse characters in games, maybe in this era, is something that interests you or that you want to push?
I think it was kind of like, I grew up with, Ellen Ripley and Sarah Connor. I thought that, fighting killer robots from the future and aliens in space, I thought that's what women did. Like, I was just like, grew up and it was a little bit of a disappointment when I came out of the 80s, to be honest. And so I tried to get into the, an industry where I could kind of make that happen.
Yeah.
Heavenly Sword, I talked a lot about Conan in that interview, but particularly what I learned about the character of Valeria in the first Conan movie, which is the best of the two original Arnie movies. And and that's what I was kind of wanting to channel into Noriko. And there's a bit in Conan where she's taught, she and Conan are in love, they're having lots of sweaty, hot, barbarian sex, and she's feeling something that she's not felt before, and I'm kind of paraphrasing her little speech, but he wants to go off and hunt down Thulsa Doom for killing his family and his village, and she's got something she's never had before, and she's so desperate to hold on to it. And she says something, I'm kind of paraphrasing the speech, but she talks about in the darkest of nights, I would walk by the tents of others and see figures holding each other in the firelight, but I always pass by. And it's just about, she could never have a life, and she could never have, being a warrior meant she was giving up, companionship and love, and now she got it, she was going to fight to the death to hold on to it. And that was kind of what I wanted to channel into Noriko, that what you give up to be a kind of a stoic warrior, and what happens if that kind of breaks. And with Noriko, it's very much kind of like when she's condemned to die, she starts to live more, and she starts to kind of understand about living and what's really worth living for. Even though she knows that, she's kind of damned, she's able to live in that moment much more clearly than anything else.
I guess that relates to Lara Croft, too, in some ways.
Yeah. There's a lot of... certainly I always kind of talk about or joke about, crystal dynamics. Were thinking of me, and they go, Rhianna Pratchett, British, check, female, check, possible father issues, check. And they're like, yep, they're the Tomb Raider writer.
Perfect writer.
And yeah, you don't know how hard I kicked back against the father issues in the game, especially in Rise. I've just kind of talked openly how I was not down with the father issues. And, you know, some of our original ideas in Rise were much more about Lara's trauma, having gone through the first game, and how she was really haunted about the friends she had lost and not being able to save them, and just the things she'd uncovered about, and still dealing with, like, I thought the world was one way and it's completely not, and what does that mean, and where do I fit in? And she was dealing a lot with that. She was acting out a lot, and you know, they kind of became more father issue stuff, which seems to be quite a popular theme in the kind of the Tomb Raider world. And yeah, I just had to find a little bit of peace with it, really, because you've got to do your job at the end of the day.
But you were able to bring in other elements that you were more interested in.
Yeah, so I sort of, like, I thought, oh God, I'm going to have to channel my own father issues into it a little bit. But I actually, something I was very pleased I got the opportunity to was I wrote Richard Croft's letters to his daughter when she's at school. Yeah. And in an interview, my dad, who had Alzheimer's, early onset Alzheimer's, and died of Alzheimer's, he'd said in an interview, and he talked about the night that I was born, and I was kind of born in a snowstorm, and it was kind of a difficult birth, and everyone was relieved when I kind of turned up, and he'd gone home, drunk half a bottle of whiskey, found a bit of stewing steak at the bottom of the freezer, like hammered it for like an hour until it was like tender enough to eat, fried it up with a lot of onions, tried to make some snowshoes out of tennis rackets, fell into the snow drunk, then like crawled into bed and went to sleep with a cat. And so I kind of channeled that into Richard Croft's memory of when Lara was born, to kind of... So Dad in an interview said that was the memory he didn't want to lose, and so I put it into the game, so that in some sense it would still be out there, and that was a nice thing to be able to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask you a little bit about your father, and if people don't know, Rhianna's father is Timbre Pratchett, the Discworld series, very well-known writer. And I was curious about how has that affected your career, and has it helped it? Has it hindered it? Are you sometimes like, stop talking about my father? I'm here, and I'm a good writer myself. What is that like for you?
It's different. It's been different things at different times. Yeah. I think anyone who's got a parent that has any level of fame it's kind of like, it's textured. How you feel? It's very textured. And yeah, it's at times been frustrating, and it's sort of like my whole career has been dismissed because I had a famous dad, and it was like, I went to work at PC Zone magazine as an editorial assistant. Like I wasn't catapulted into like a heady, glamorous like career. And I kind of worked hard in an industry where there were very few women writers. And I can look back across my career and say, there's these. I got this little project there, and then this one was slightly big, and then I did this, and I learned about this, and then so I can see my kind of career trajectory. But I would the 4-channel Reddit threads where as women in industry you get dissected, and so that would come up as she's only got where she has because of her father. Like, my father had nothing to do with any of my game career. Like, he played games, he got me into games. That's probably like the extent of his influence into the game side of things. So I grew up playing games with Dad, and I'd sort of sit next to him when he'd been playing like Night Law or Alien Highway, and I'd get out the graph paper and I'd draw the maps for him, or I'd sit behind, like, he had a big office chair, and I'd sit behind it like a human bolster cushion and kind of peer out as he was like driving the game and I was navigating him and things. And then I grew up with a little girl that lived next door. And I lived in such a sneeze of a village, basically. We didn't even have a one-horse to be a one-horse town. It was no other kids in the village, and then a little girl of a similar age moved next door to me, and her dad worked for Hewlett-Packard. And so he would get all the kind of best machines, so we would like sit and play like King's Quest and Space Quest and Leisure Suit Larry, and an 8-year-old and an 11-year-old girl playing Leisure Suit Larry. But it was like back in the days when Larry was like 8 pixels.
Yes.
And they sort of barred the game by asking you questions like, are you 18 questions, but they'd be like about the American political process, so we'd actually go and have to look things up in books to get into a game, which was great. But we learned the word prophylactic from Leisure Suit Larry, which I think is an important word for young ladies to know. And I also learned the word falafel from Conquest of Camelot, and I lived in like deepest, darkest Somerset, and it was a long way from a falafel, let alone a good falafel. And I was sort of, for some reason, like the falafel is a word that's ingrained in a room in my mind, because I remember it so clearly and think, oh, this just sounds like a marvelous thing. And it was, when I moved to London, I had my first falafel. I was very disappointed. And then when I went to the Middle East and had proper falafels, it was like, yes, this is the falafel of my dreams. So I grew up playing games, and Dad was a big part of that. And the writing side of things, it's like, how does water influence a fish? Yeah. Like it's in subtle ways. It's not necessarily. He wasn't trying to grow another writer, he was trying to grow a human being. And sort of like just making me open-minded and curious about the world and curious about people and wanting to know people's stories, and being curious about the natural world and reading a lot. And it was sort of like building, I guess, a writer subtly, but focusing on a human being first.
And I think you had mentioned also that your mother is also creative, and she was is a painter, and in her kind of as a hobby. Do you think having 2 creative parents kind of made that path a little bit easier? Because it wasn't like, hey parents, I'm going to go be a video game writer, and they're like, what? No, be an insurance agent.
I mean, they didn't want me to do art, weirdly, because my mum showed a lot of talent for art when she was quite young, and she was sort of pushed into doing the equivalent of art A-level when she was 14. She went and qualified as an art illustrator, and was an art teacher for a while. And Dad, as well as writing, he did some illustrations. He was a very good cartoonist. He illustrated the first edition of the Carpet People. And it's frankly unfair, really. If you're going to be a genius level wraiter, you should not
Also
get
an artist.
art abilities as well. He was a terrible cook, which is basically that's the at least there's something. So I always, for a while, I thought that I got my, let's march off in this direction. That seems to be there's a gap there. I'm not someone that needs to see someone else doing something first. It's like, oh, no one's doing anything, I'll go over here and do that. And I was kind of thought I got that from my dad, but I actually got that as much from my mum. So when she was doing her art degree, she would do things that other people weren't doing. So she illustrated sci-fi books because no one else was doing it. She studied Japanese prints because no one else was doing it. So it's definitely a family trait to kind of look for the path less traveled, really.
Yeah. I was curious, what do you think this is a learning conference, so everybody here is to learn and listen to each other. What are some of those biggest learnings that you've had in your career? What was the big aha moment?
Now you want me to impart wisdom?
Yes, I do.
I think understanding that everything, as I mentioned before, all facets of game development more or less fold into narrative, and it is actually too important just to be left to the writers. But writers can be the evangelists, they can be the kind of visionaries, they can help pull everything together. And what's been challenging about my career is because I work freelance, because I go into, I'm kind of parachuted into studios and projects and things, and I never know what I'm going to get, really, because it was all dependent on time and budget and genre and how much the team cares about narrative, how seriously they're taking it. So there's kind of no maps for these territories and no guides, really. At least there weren't when I started. But I think, so I kind of learned a lot on the job, and empowering other people and getting them excited about story and narrative and how they can contribute in their discipline to it, I think has been kind of a great learning experience.
Yeah.
And yeah, I was always worried as I grew up as an only child I wouldn't be good at working with other writers, but I'm actually a lot better than I thought, and I'm much more collaborative than I kind of imagined I was going to be. And I think it's just from growing up in an industry where there are so few writers, like if you found another writer, it's like, you know, a kindred spirit. Like you look for like that one level designer that cared about narrative, and and you kind of stick like glue to them. So it's so wonderful to have seen part of the industry develop, to go from the UK game writers used to be 3 people in a pub, and I remember when we would just kind of get together and kind of grumble about our projects, and now it's like rooms full of people, and it's all kind of young whippersnappers and things. And I would say to you, I sometimes feel like Quint in Jaws, where I'm just like scratching my nails down the board, going, "You all know me, you know what I do," and it's actually wonderful to see. It's nice to kind of be in an elder stateswoman type role, and I do a lot of consultancy now, and I feel very blessed to have had and then continuing the career that I have, and been able to work on so many different genres. Working a lot with female characters, doing comedy stuff, doing a lot of cinematic stuff, working with some great actors, and being on seeing that wave build really, and that kind of interest in narrative grow, and people talking about stories, and there being narrative tracks at conferences, and awards for games writing, and awards for games writing where the presenter is not mean about games before they present the award, which used to definitely be the case when I was starting out, and just seeing it grow has been wonderful. But it's learning that everything in a game contributes to the story, and so it can't just be here is the game and here is the story on top. It has to be organically kind of put together. Like, people have to talk to other people. You need to talk to the people that, as I say, they're going to sweat to get your script into the game. You've got to kind of get involved in things. You've got to ask questions. You've got to make sure if you're working off-site there are good communication loops in place. And kind of know your value as writers, and know that you'll have a lot of battles to fight. So it's sort of choosing your battles as well. It's sort of, I always maintain that writers need to be gamers. I do know a few writers that have gone into games that don't play games, but certainly having come from a gamer background and then as a game journalist, and understanding as a player and then understanding how to analyze it a little bit more has been very, very useful for me. And being able to kind of talk to developers and feel like your kindred spirits as well.
I guess you can also understand the struggles they might be having as they're trying to get what you've written into the game. You have some empathy there for their
I've definitely learned quite a lot about design from doing writing and narrative design as well, which I kind of ended up having to do because there weren't usually narrative designers, so it became a sort of a second skill set for me. And I also did a little bit of audio direction as well. So on the first Overlord game, I co-directed the audio, and on the second game, I directed the audio and kind of cast it as well. And that was a lot of fun because all writers are a bit of control freaks anyway. So the more that you can hold on to your scripts, like from conception to the page into the studio, that's really satisfying. And getting writers involved with the actors and being able to talk to the actors about the characters and being there in the room to make changes and in recordings and things like that is kind of very important.
What is the biggest thing you'd like to see change in the games industry?
Oh, gosh.
Just an easy, light final question there.
I'd like to see more women in senior positions. I think, we were talking about that earlier, that I have worked with one female narrative designer in my career. I've never worked with a female game director. I've never worked with a female creative director. And that's so weird for me. And the narrative designers also on the Overlord games, I think we kind of found it fun that we were both the women on the game were working in narrative, that we kind of embraced like hyper feminine stuff, and we brought each other My Little Ponies because she had a My Little Pony collection, and I think we were going through. You know, it was a challenging part. I said, Hanukkah, if we get through this, I'm going to buy you a new My Little Pony. And she said, I want one with wings, please. So I got her one with wings. And then she modded a My Little Pony for me and turned it into a bloody unicorn, which is the bloody unicorns are in the Overlord, and she'd given it like, you know, Niall talks about them being, you know, overrated pit ponies, and she'd got its little cloak, and she'd sequined Pit Pony onto the thing, and it had a minion through its horn, and yeah, so that's one of my favourite possessions. But yeah, more, I'd like to see more women in senior roles, and kind of more writers as well. Like one of the things I have to deal, that I have to kind of deal with is I don't have hard power. I'm not with the team all the time. I don't have the power to say, okay, this is how we're doing it, usually. So generally you do with kind of game directors or creative directors, people like Amy Hennig, Neil Druckmann, Ken Levine, who are, writers, but they also understand game design, and they have the hard power to say, we're doing it this way. And I've had to kind of, it's power versus freedom. So I wanted the freedom to be able to go on to different projects, work with different developers, work on different genres, different platforms. I wanted to kind of work in TV and film and comics and books. I wanted to do all the things. And it was like, that was more important to me than having a lot of power in one place. So yeah, I'd like to see, the kind of continuation, the kind of building of the wave that we've got. More writers in senior positions and kind of people with strong narrative sensibilities heading up studios, more women in senior positions. But yeah, just taking writers more kind of seriously. And I have seen it grow. But yeah, it's been a battle. Games have often been kind of underrated and maligned in other industries, and there's so much kind of potential and more personal stories, I think. Right. Like what I think has, I talked about the memory of, Dad's memory and putting that into a game and how that changed things for me. And I also worked a lot on Lost Words Beyond the Page, which is a little indie game, and that's all about the journey of grief and the intersection of grief and love and memory. And I put a lot of what I'd gone through on kind of journeys of grief, particularly actually when losing my grandparents. And being able to bring something personal to it, to have something to say. And the indie scene in development world, I think we're getting some great, more personal, more thoughtful games coming out. And I want to see that influencing the big AAA games as well. Yeah. And seeing that middle ground grow, like when, towards the end of, or the sort of, I guess the mid-noughties, it felt like the middle ground of games had disappeared. Like it was just AAA and indie, and there was nothing in between. There was no kind of like Overlord games anymore. We're starting to see like the middle ground growing back again, where you've got things like sort of Senua's Sacrifice, Hellblade, that are taking the best of AAA and the kind of the inspiration and the creativity and the little bit more freedom that you get from kind of indie studios. So sort of seeing that kind of growing again and taking like the best of both worlds, I think would be great.
I guess there's those studios that have the flexibility to be able to do that. Maybe that's, I think, my final question. Yes. I'm getting a thumbs up from Jenny. Okay. But is what you were just talking about, so maybe seeing some more diverse folks in more senior positions and then telling more personal stories. Do you think those two things are related?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the diverse teams are always stronger because of the viewpoints that you're getting. And not, when I was starting out, people used to talk about diversity and it was always just about women. And it was just like, but it's a much bigger thing. It's not, it's about ethnicity and sexual orientation and ability and age. There's so many ways of kind of being diverse. It's kind of not just about women, and it still frustrates me. It's starting to die off now, but the kind of every woman that's worked in the games industry has been asked to write about being a woman working in the games industry, and it spawns a look, women are playing games.
Yeah.
And it was just like, this has been going on for 20 years. Can we just broaden the conversation a little bit? But I think that is starting to happen, but more of it, more of all the things that are happening.
Yeah. You, I think do we have 5 more minutes? Yes, I'm getting a nod. That actually relates to something you mentioned before too, is that after, I'm sure people know about Gamergate that happened in the 2000s, it was a horrible moment for women in games. I left the internet for about a year at that time, but I know it affected you as well, and you mentioned that after that, you were only asked onto panels to talk about women in games rather than your amazing career.
Yeah, it was that. Obviously, there are a lot of women and other minorities that got caught up in it a lot more heavily than I did, but I think it had ramifications for all minorities within the games industry, to be honest. And like before that, I would be invited onto things, onto a panel with Tim Chafer to talk about comedy in games, or talk about environmental storytelling, or talk about my career, which is, to be honest, more important to me than my gender. And I never wanted to talk about being a woman in games for a long time, because I didn't want to be like pigeonholed or put a label on, and so it took me a long time, probably until Tomb Raider, and my friends would joke that I was coming out as a woman with Tomb Raider, because I felt like I could talk about being a woman in games and it was just before Gamergate. I could talk about being a woman in games. And I had a back catalogue, no one knew I wasn't filling any diversity quota or anything like that, or people would say that, but I didn't feel like it was. I could look back and say, I worked on Mirror's Edge, I worked on Heavenly Sword, I worked on the Overlord games, I've done lots of stuff, and I could feel confident, and then I would talk about it more, and I realised, although it didn't mean, talking about being a woman in games didn't mean a lot to me, it meant a lot to other people coming up, and they would reach out and talk and say, it means a lot for us to kind of see you talking about this. And I thought, I'm not doing it for me. I'm doing it for like the generations that are coming up. And then that kind of made more sense, and I felt more at ease about that. I think.
Well, I think sometimes we underestimate how important it is for people to also see people like you out there accomplishing what you have and go, oh, that person looks like me. I can do that too, right? So I hope that some people here today have taken that away.
Yeah, if I can do it, you can.
Well, thank you, Rhianna. That was a fantastic conversation. I hope people found that interesting, and to hear about your career and breaking barriers and how you got into it and some of the learnings that you've had over time. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I think we're done. You can leave now.
So thanks to Rhianna and Zoe for that illuminating talk to wrap things up. It's been fantastic. It's been it's been bigger. It's been better. I think we've delivered on what we set out to do. We'll get some feedback off you all later, especially when you've had a few drinks. I'll get the truth out of you then. Finance and Lending's doing all again next year. There you go, fantastic. Because we see the importance on it. We said last year it was the start of a journey. I think we've built on it this year. And we intend to do so even more next year. Before we all go and have a few drinks and a bite to eat together and start focusing on a great music festival we have, I want to say a few thank yous because, you know, it's easy to take an event like this for granted, and it's so professional, it's so amazing. The content's been awesome, the organisation's been awesome. It hasn't just happened. So I'd like you to put your hands together for a few groups of people I'm going to shout out. I want them to stand up and identify themselves, and I want you all to join me and give them a huge round of applause. So first, Christina and a group marketing organisation that help be the event managers of this great event. Stand up, all of you. Identify yourselves. Okay. Obviously, it's a learning and development event, so please, Jenny and her team, will you please stand up? Kirsty, where are you? She's here somewhere. She's probably not. She's probably putting up a marquee somewhere. But Kirsty Sutton and her admin team have done it's such a huge event now. The administration to sort this out is phenomenal. So please, admin team, stand up and have a big round of applause. It's been awesome. I'm not actually joking. It is fun. Anyway, you did a great job. I'd like to say that. Oh, there's another one on the table. Can you hear me now? No. Oh, third time lucky. No? Fourth time lucky? Yeah, there we go. Right. I was going to say something about thanking IT, but no, seriously, you know, all the streaming, everything that's done, they've done a remarkable job. I'm even going to let them off that microphone, and they can come back and do it again next year. So IT, thank you very much. This year we had a great group of people in the room as room hosts, helping out, directions, making sure all the talks went as smoothly as possible. I'd like to put your hands together for those. The final two groups of people have been the people who've coordinated and brought to you the great content that we've put together over this last 48 hours. And, you know, it really has been high quality. I challenge anyone to say that this content is not great. It's absolutely fantastic, and it is an absolute testimony to the talent we have in our business. So I'd like to first put your hands together for the stream leads who brought it all together. Finally, of course, the speakers themselves. All of you stand up. There's quite a few of you, so I can see you if you're there. Come on. You know, putting these talks on isn't easy as they made it look. You know, they've really stepped in, put themselves many times out of their comfort zone. Some have, you know, done it many times. Some of them are brand new to speaking. And it's been a real effort. They take a long time to put together. You can see the quality. They don't just come together overnight. These have been months in preparation. So it's been great. Thank you so much, everyone, for contributing. Thanks, everyone, for attending. Let's go to the bar.